Good afternoon, everyone. Since a great deal of my work involves the study of infectious agents, my subjects are at risk of getting a revenge on me. I hope, therefore, my larynx will hold up. I also have another major disease, which is to show a lot of slides. So although this will come up at the end, that website there will actually have all these slides on it. It may be on now, but it'll certainly be on tomorrow, so it permits you to move quickly past them. In speaking to an audience as broad as this, some of you are intimately familiar with the challenges of healthcare, some of you are not, and therefore I've tried to sort of set a general perspective because healthcare has to be debated well beyond the science and technology of medicine because it is a very complex socio-economic ecosystem, and I rather like the first bullet there, which was coined by Alan Garber when he was at Stanford, who's now the provost at Harvard. Healthcare is an expensive menu without prices. And if you actually look at the trajectory for economic costs, where we're approximating 20% of the gross domestic product in a few years, we really have to look as to how healthcare will be sustainable. Sustainable at the economic level on behalf of society. And obviously, we, for the most part, have a sickness system rather than a health system. We present ourselves for the most part when we are sick, and the issue of health and wellness is to some extent a secondary phenomenon. That has to be inverted. At the same time, I am prototypic of the next booming cohort of individuals to become aged, and with that goes the inevitable burden of chronic disease. How we manage this cohort of aged boomers and their chronic disease burden in an era which must of necessity be characterized by economic constraint, and the healthcare system is dysfunctional. We basically have a bill more, do more system. One is rewarded for intervention rather than prevention, and we will again have to examine some of these challenges because this essentially is the broader issue of how do we move our cost equation, courtesy of science and technology, from the red circles, where we're consuming, that's what accounts for $2.7 trillion each year. How do we move all of us back into those green circles where we're healthy and have a lower disease risk? The purple one of acute disease will always be with us, whether we drive badly or something happens in terms of an acute infection. But it's the two big red circles that we have to mitigate. It's about mitigating risk of the development of that disease. We may not nip it in the bud immediately, but actually preventing its progression, which is where the real costs build up. And then the last red circle will become one of the most difficult ethical issues for this society, which is ill-prepared to take on. You only saw the stridency in the last round of political debate about death panels. But we cannot continue to go on expending the amount of money which we spend in the last 6 months of life. If it was replete with quality of life, it would be a different debate, but tragically, it isn't. So we have to think about where are the value propositions going to derive from in healthcare, and overwhelmingly it is how do we reduce risk to society, to the system, and to you and I as individuals, and wellness versus illness. We are poised to see the emergence of a new healthcare ecosystem, which is my talk today, which is the technological convergence of molecular medicine with digital networks and social media. And in that, we have to shift from a reactive system, namely, I don't feel well today, so I go and see the physician, and that's episodic, to a cradle-to-grave continuum where all elements of my potential risk and your risk is identified in a much more proactive way to mitigate that. And we have to go from a one-size-fits-all treatment approach, which is the nature of this talk, personalized or precision medicine. Just to give you an example, here is the percentage of the population for whom a particular class of drugs do not work. And the numbers are very disturbing indeed in terms of not only therapeutic ineffectiveness, but the cost is shown at the bottom. And if you look at cancer, which is destined by the statistics offered by the National Cancer Institute for all major malignancies to grow by between 20 and 40% by 2025. If we continue in this way, we will have some very serious economic as well as clinical issues. So if we look at the history of medicine, it has really progressed from superstition to symptoms, which is where we're mostly still trapped today, to at least the emergent dimension of measuring molecular signatures of health and disease. So we're going to get into some omics. The last time I saw it, there were 400. Last time it was Google, there were 440 omics, but at least let's limit those. The genome is meant to be the king of omics, namely that is the genetic instruction code for the trillions of cells and the 37 organs that exist in our body. But that is merely the primary source code. It is how that genome in each of the differentiated cell types in our body gets expressed in terms of proteins, how those proteins form networks, how the network is regulated, and then move into the bottom. How does that network get perturbed, which we call disease, and what are the signals which are unique to individual patients that relate to that network perturbation? Because sort of reduced to its basis proportion, this is what personalized, I actually prefer the word precision, because personalized medicine will probably never be achievable economically, that you actually have a drug for every single individual. You just couldn't do it. But nonetheless, becoming increasingly rational. Right diagnosis, it's a sobering perspective to think that 50% of all diagnoses are wrong initially. Might as well have a coin toss. Right? I have a very good friend who's a primary physician. He says, look, this is a very real dilemma. 80% of the people who come to see me have non-specific symptoms. I could go and see him and say, I've got a sore throat. And I either get better and he doesn't see me again, or I get worse and he can make a more definitive diagnosis. But for the serious diseases, we cannot accept that level of diagnostic error, because diagnostic error means that the treatment may not be mobilized correctly, and each of us are unique. Even if we've got monozygotic twins, we are still unique. The right patient at the right time. Because this is now the world of molecular medicine. The ability to profile a whole series of analytes in a disease process, so whether it be genes or proteins, take your pick. In this case, it happens to be a gene expression network in leukemia. And what you can see on the far side is the fact that those patients may have identical symptoms. The histopathologist would look at the bone marrow and say, yes, they're identical, but when you resolve it at the molecular level, you can see the top panel has a set of genes that are blue, and the one below, and right there, that will correlate with the fact that only the blue group will respond to the treatment which is available. Then you elucidate that further into a network diagram, and understanding where this has gone wrong, what is the dysregulation in that network, to hopefully devise rational strategies that where those asterisks are, if that is an alteration in the network diagram versus the healthy network, then those asterisk points either become intervention points for new diagnostics that tell you the difference between the red and the blues there, or alternatively, they become targets for drugs. And we've already had some success in that insofar as in breast cancer. This was really the first to really prototype this mechanism, and that is that women with breast cancer who express the HER2 gene have this receptor HER2 and will respond to Herceptin. If a woman doesn't have that receptor, she should not receive the drug because she won't respond to it. Most recently, we've seen the ALK gene, which is only present in about 4% of people with lung cancer, but if you have that gene, then that mutation in that gene, you will respond impeccably to that drug from Pfizer's Xalkori. KRAS, the two drugs there for colorectal carcinoma, if you have a mutation in the KRAS gene, you will not respond to those drugs. And given the fact that those drugs cost $80,000 a treatment cycle, you can see the logical element of this as an economic argument as well as a clinical argument. And then most recently, in a disease we all have to be very mindful of living in Arizona, which is the question of melanoma and excessive exposure to the sun. And if you have that particular V600 mutation, you will respond. But more on this challenge later. Because what I want to introduce you to is what we colloquially refer to as the IPOP, namely the integrated personal omics profiling, because that's the foundation for all of this, namely what's my profile, what's your profile. And integrating that becomes the logical intellectual foundation for molecular medicine, because all of us are here, but each of us have got a genetic uniqueness, our epigenome, which I'll come to in a moment, our proteome, our metabolome, our glycome, our immunome. We could go on till cocktail hour, but the overall issue is how do you integrate that into your profile and my profile to understand what's unique about what's happened to me or you in terms of network regulation, because this is essentially the overarching principle here. What is the genome? How does that genome get altered in life, the so-called exposome? How far does our behavior and the social networks we belong to influence those two issues, particularly the exposome? And that gives rise to what the physician will see, namely you as a patient or you as a well individual, namely that's your phenotype. But in reality, hate to break this to you, but there are phenomes. It's not just your one single phenotype. There are phenomes lurking. You may be well today, but incubating away in there are a series of issues, whether it be type 2 diabetes, predisposition to be an axe murderer, or whatever. You know, it is there. So it is the question of both profiling populations, which we have to do to identify the correlations with individual risk. So facile integration of diverse data sets, that's the IOMICS, integrated omics domain. What does that then mean for actionable information in terms of risk? We're back to risk management. That's the essence of contemporary medicine, because that's what's going to drive value. Put another way, what's my profile, your profile? How do we analyze it and how do we act on that information? Either to detect disease earlier, diagnose disease more precisely to give rise to rational therapy. How do we monitor my health status longer term in a longitudinal way? And equally important, what lurks in my genome or my epigenome that may predispose me to disease at a later date? So if there was one trend that is going to become increasingly dominant, I would submit, it is that the power of diagnostics will, you may, for some of you who live in this field, you hear about the word companion diagnostics for the selection of the right drug. In reality, it's companion therapeutics, because the diagnostics become the primary decision determinant as to what particular drug will be used. But the point I want to make on this slide is the fact that when you have your annual physical and they exsanguinate you vampire-like to extract as many cc's as they possibly can and send it off, most of the things they look at when you get that printout back, sodium, potassium, urea, creatinine, they're single analytes. They may measure multiple analytes, but the report is on your blood urea nitrogen or your platelets. What we're moving to now are very complex multiplex assays where thousands, if not tens of thousands of analytes are being analyzed simultaneously. And then there is, of course, the whole genome, which we'll come to in a moment. The trend there is the fact that this will move. Today, we primarily conduct through LabCorp and Quest and others this centralized testing in large installed capital-based laboratories. Namely, there's a fleet of trucks that run around, take your blood and your urine, goes to a central lab. We will move increasingly towards an increasingly decentralized system, whether it be on-body, in-body sensors that are monitoring my health status today or my compliance, and also so-called point-of-need devices. But all of this, of course, won't come as a surprise to this audience that we are en route to come to do something which alarms most people in medicine. Namely, we're going to become an information-intensive domain. It's got some very ugly clouds on the horizon for the way we do academic research, the way we do clinical care, the way we supply, and while the business models and overwhelmingly new operational competencies will be needed. So probably even if you're not in this field, you hear a lot about the fact that the era of the $1,000 genome. Remember, a decade ago, it took $3 billion to basically assemble the first human genome sequence, and it wasn't really that complete anyway. We still don't have a totally complete sequence, but like most other elements of contemporary technology, the price-performance curve drives downwards. So now we are indeed on the cusp of the $1,000 genome. You can send off to 23andMe and get your exomes profiled. You can send off to Illumina and even get it for your iPad or your iPhone. And I don't know what you do with it, but nonetheless, you have it on your iPad or your iPhone, and it's a good chat-up line in bars, I'm told. Would you like to see my genome? But the issue is the fact that even if you've got a $1,000 genome, what is going to be the cost to analyze and interpret that, given our comparative ignorance, which I'll talk about in a moment? And longer term, what is going to be the storage costs? Essentially, a full genome is probably about 3 gigabytes. So you start extending that to the population at large, you quickly get into petabyte range, and you can certainly on a global scale quickly think about zettabyte levels. But if you're going to use it clinically, you want that information stat. So that is the fact, no ambiguity. What do I do? The busy doc who's got 7 minutes to see people, they can't look at some huge genome scan. They want a traffic light. Red, don't do it. Green, do it. Yellow, we don't know. Because that is tragically the front line at which this has to be done. And of course, people want the best, but they're not prepared to pay for it. So there are very complex reimbursement issues here. But if you sat in the FDA, this wonderful technology is coming at you rapidly. But that's the question you should be asking in the top box. What is a complete and accurate analysis? And if I was at the FDA, I would be deeply concerned by the superficiality of what is being projected by some in the genome community today, because we do not have a complete and accurate analysis. You can take the two most advanced genome sequencing platforms from Life Technology and from Illumina, and they will have, on the same sample, they'll have about a 95% concordance on what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms and a 20% concordance on copy number variants. Is that ready for prime time? Absolutely not. We will get there. All of these problems will fall by the wayside, but there is too much glib hyperbole with regard to the fact that your genome is going to determine all issues at hand, because I don't want to bore you with the blue side of the equation there, but that's, if you're going to profile a genome, that's what you've got to map, because you're looking for the top box. How do you correlate changes for those markers in the blue box to your relationship to disease? What does that then mean on the pink side for the genomicist or the informatician or the doctor who's got to make the decision? And obviously in the center of the other issues. And then healthcare is a very sensitive issue, even though, of course, you can get your hands on most people's health information if you want to at any given time, but it becomes a great talking point for the lawyers to make money. The Genome Project is about 10 years old, and about 2 weeks ago there was a massive series of papers under this next iteration called Encode, which is really the guidebook to the human genome. And what it tells us is that it is a remarkable information coding network. I don't want to bore you with what's on this slide, but in these 3 billion base pairs that make up your genome and my genome, roughly only 1.5% of it actually codes for proteins to create those protein networks. The rest of it used to be colloquially known as junk, but many years ago the Nobel laureate Sidney Brenner said, I wouldn't be too sure. Remember, garbage is what you throw away. Junk is what you keep in the attic because you don't know what to do with, right? And that's exactly what it's turned out to be, that 98% of the genome is in fact regulating the 1.5% of the coding genes. It's a remarkable sophistication. Under bullet 2 there, you can see just the number of regulatory, for those 21,000 genes, you've got all these different combinations which can be brought about. If the same gene is regulated by different promoters or enhancers, you get a different product out of that information. And the last bullet is particularly important because our 23 chromosomes that sort of sit there in this very complex three-dimensional topography, it isn't just some sort of passive blob that sits there inside a nucleus. They have a precise three-dimensional topology because the folding of the DNA in the chromosomes means that something on chromosome 17 can be juxtaposed to promoter on chromosome 4 and is absolutely essential, or alternatively a new juxtaposition can give rise to disease. So my admonition is the fact that you hear people talk about, well, we've discovered the gene for X or the gene for Y. They haven't. They found a gene which is intimately correlated and may be causal, but they don't understand the network. So if everything was based upon genes, just finding the gene, we'd all be happy. But it isn't. It's far more complex, and to basically modify James Carville, it's the network, stupid. That's what we have to look at, because it is this. It is what we previously characterized as junk, or some did. This is this very complex 98% of the DNA regulating the 1.5 to 2% that creates the protein networks. How then do those networks get established, and what are the perturbations in that network that give rise to disease? And then there's the epigenome. So that is why no two of us are identical, and you do not carry the same DNA that you came into this world with when you leave it, because elements of your DNA will be modified, that's referred to as epigenetic modification, as a result of things you get exposed to. And there's a fascinating domain which is beginning to involve, there was a series of statistical principles which had enunciated this on epidemiological grounds a number of years ago, called the fetal origin of disease. Do events that occur within the womb actually affect the epigenetic structure of DNA? And it's beginning to indicate it is. A fascinating example, it's not just alcohol and smoking. Fascinating example from the Netherlands in World War II, where dietary restriction imposed as a result of Nazi occupation meant that there was dietary-induced epigenetic modification in people because of chronic starvation. And those same epigenetic modifications are turning up in their children and their grandchildren. So this whole issue of the genome is far from understood, and it's far from straightforward. So you've seen this side of the diagram before and in top, but this is what we now have to do, because we now have to understand information flow in cellular networks as the basis for understanding regulation, health, and dysregulation, disease. And I was saying to Ron earlier, one of the great advantages we have is the fact that so much of the structure of information flow in intracellular networks in biology and medicine can essentially be overlaid into a scale-free network of any kind. So some of the best information we get today is what can folks working on distributed denial of service attacks on the internet teach us about the relatively primitive understanding we have about circuit diagrams of cells. Because if you now go back to my black asterisk, you say, aha, there's the disease. Those points are now dysregulated in disease. I'm going to target my drug to that asterisk. Sounds great, except we're dealing with not a single target, it's the network. And here is the types of problems that we face. So I introduced you to the BRAF 600 melanoma drug a little earlier. So here is a gentleman with what is referred to as miliary melanoma, horrifying disease on the far left there with all these multiple metastatic nodules. Then hit with a drug that hits one of those asterisk points. 6 weeks later, 13 weeks later, miraculous, they're all gone. And then 6 weeks after that, it's back with a totally different mutation, because now you've had, even though most of the cells in that far left-hand side were killed by the drug, tragically there was a clone or clones that had a different circuit diagram that permitted them to have an adaptive circumvention of the effect of that drug. So we have to get a lot smarter. Targeted therapies, yes, but we have to understand network information flow to rationally design to hit pathways and subnetworks, not single molecular targets. And in cancer, it's probably the most extreme issue of all. So here is a renal cell carcinoma, and it's only meant to show that different regions of the same tumor are so vastly different, got a totally different genetic composition, and the metastases, different metastases, is all in the same patient. So there's zonal heterogeneity in the primary tumor and network perturbations which are completely unique in each of the metastases. Now, are you going to ever be able to tackle that with a single drug or even a limited cocktail of drugs? I regret I've got a rather pessimistic message for you in that context. So it raises a very disturbing question. Is the multiplicity of points of dysregulation in advanced metastatic disease or an advanced neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer, is the network so perturbed that the prospect of being able to strike at one or two asterisk points to reset that network is probably infinitely small? So in cancer, could the patient withstand it because of the toxic nature of the drugs we're using? In other diseases, could we actually find enough drugs to get into that cocktail? So what that really means is the fact, if you look at the three biggest costs that we're facing as a society in healthcare, other than infectious disease, cancer, if we could detect it before the metastatic horse has left the stable, so the cancer cells go to other organs, surgeons, increasingly robotic surgeons, are very good at removing that primary tumor. It's the question, but at the moment we spend 97% of all our research dollars hunting for therapeutic targets to go after the asterisk, and only 3% of our expenditures on diagnostics. I think that's got to be inverted. And despite having spent a lifetime in the pharmaceutical industry, we've got to change that diagnostic therapeutic balance, because if we can detect cancer before it metastasizes, and I don't mean screen the entire population, it simply means when you come for your annual physical, we say, yep, everything looks good except that we've got a warning signal from organ A or organ B, and then the imaging people go to work, and it's very easy to, with the exception of the brain, but increasingly even in the brain, a centimeter wide tumor is easily excised, and if you excise it before it's metastasized, it's called what? Cure. Right? The second one is diabetes and obesity, combination known as diabesity, destined to be the single biggest healthcare cost in the United States by 2020. For the most part, and we're all at risk of not adopting the right type of lifestyle, so I'm not being pious, he said, patting his ever-growing belly. All of us, you can modulate most elements of diabesity as a consequence of not only excellent drugs, but also lifestyle. So there's a different equation. The cancer one is entirely technological. This is more social, cultural. And the worst one of all is the fact that what is the merit of an early diagnosis of Alzheimer's if you have no therapeutics? And you probably saw just from general reading, 2 of the most advanced Alzheimer's drugs just crashed and burned in advanced trials, but I would submit it's because we're testing them in people tragically whose cognitive decline is so great that their network perturbations could never be reversed simply by using a single drug. The only issue there, the dilemma of early diagnosis without therapeutics being available, is the fact even if you speak to people who are facing this dilemma, they say, Doc, this is far better than having the inability to put my affairs in order or to be able to deal with issues in terms of quality of life. So those 3 each present different problems, but nonetheless legitimacy. And then I won't spend any time on this, but this is becoming increasingly important. We are outnumbered. We are outnumbered. The number of cells we have, human cells in our body, is only 1/10 of the number of microbial cells which are lurking in us at this very moment. Not exactly cocktail party facts, but each of someone my size is carrying about 2.2 kilos of bacteria in their body. And the nature of those bacteria are becoming increasingly important in understanding the way drugs are metabolized by the bugs, how bugs metabolize carcinogens in the environment, how far this predisposes to immune disorders, and fascinatingly, the changes in that microbiome in the aged, particularly when they move from an in-home setting to a community care home, and the predispositions that often go with that. So this is a space to be watched. So this is the slide you've seen. So how do we now move beyond the science and at the same time think about driving the costs from the red to the green? Everyone talks about wellness, everyone talks about patient-centric care, but it's the bottom line. Anyone who talks about patient-centric care without engaging patients is homozygous at the genes for delusion. I mean, it's as simple as that. So the invasion of the body trackers, this is going to be a very major dimension. So this is M, or mobile health, the convergence of medicine with material science, automation and miniaturization, engineering, and remote device senses permits us to increasingly now sustain, to profile individual health by on or in-body sensors, not only for people who are ill, the top partly there, monitoring their health, how far we can utilize that information to optimize our own wellness, and how far that also becomes the conduit for health information. And healthcare products merge increasingly into the consumer retail. This is taking your own electrocardiogram just by holding an iPhone modification up to your chest, and that's a very simple signal for a computer to track. And every so often, if you get a call, come in, you know you need to come in quick. But I mean, these are the sorts of things. And again, we only have 15% of the nursing homes that we need in this country for my age group over the next 15 years. A large number of people will have to live at home, often without a caregiver. So how can you utilize the instrumented home, the instrumented person, for the detection of disease or taking their medicine? The average 65-year-old is taking 3 medicines. the average 75-year-old is taking 11 medicines, even if you don't have cognitive decline. Did I or didn't I today? Right? Whereas if you can actually monitor that with smart capsules, now something called glow caps, whereby if you don't take your medicine at the right time, it starts flashing a signal, calls your cell phone or calls your caregiver. These are the sorts of issues because, yes, it's about taking care of patients, but in the end, yes, it's about quality of life and dignity, but in the end, it's about economics. We cannot have people not taking their medicines properly. The earlier we detect someone's declining health status, the better. At the same time, it carries all these other issues. Not having to go to the doctor's office, e-pharmacy, getting new tools. We just talked about drugs, reduced hospital admissions. It's fascinating that the issue of the question of all of you have been through it. The doc who's been looking after you will come along and say, well, Ron, great, hope all works well. That's it. Pat on the back, shake of the hand, 30 seconds. And a high proportion of those people are back in the hospital, particularly if they've got complex needs, within 2 weeks to 4 weeks. If they're discharged by a nurse practitioner or a counselor who spends an hour with them, Ron, do you understand the nature of this medicine? If you don't, here's my number, give me a call. That dramatically reduces readmission, so it's a social dimension. And then, of course, social media is pervasive. Who knows why people do what they do? The fact is, it really doesn't matter. The fact is that they do it and we can measure it. I mean, that is the essence of social media. Social media meets medicine. We can begin to identify people's behavior and their patterns of behavior. Patients are no longer prepared, quite appropriately. Cyberchondria is a well-known phenomenon that, people read their symptoms off the internet and think that they have a disease that's only previously been found in a remote tribe of Papuan Indians, but that's a slightly different issue, and there's a generational gap. Younger physicians are much more at ease with their patients coming in with the latest issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. And living on a large campus, students say, why the hell do I need to go across town, be kept waiting 45 minutes beyond my appointment time, surrounded by a lot of old people coughing on me, right? When much of this can actually be done remotely. Patients aren't going to accept the paternalism of the profession. They're becoming much more engaged. So the Love Army of Women is a group of women who volunteered, who record a whole series of signs, and some of them tragically will go down with breast cancer, but you can begin to identify the correlates of that. Patients like me say, when you think about it, only 3% of cancer patients are enrolled in trials of new drugs. If the drugs we had were so effective, that would be fine, but they're not. It's because it's an ignorance question and they're not made aware of it. That's going to change. So patient advocacy and consumer caregiver will become increasingly important. It permits us to recruit into clinical trials the engaged patient. When patients are talking to each other, I was involved with a clinical trial recently in which someone would go on the web and say, I've got this funny tingling sensation in my hands. Is anyone else having this? And within 30 minutes, 8 other people said, yes, I've got that. Turned out, because in cancer trials there's a problem known as Handfoot syndrome, and it turned out that all those people were on the highest dose of the drug. Drop the dose back, it all goes away. But you speak to the docs involved, oh yeah, everyone has that. There wouldn't have been any change. It was the patients driving that themselves that made the difference. So why you're all here, of course, at this meeting is because of this challenge, the fastest growing resource on Earth. And although I've talked a little bit about genomics and network diagrams, there's a huge computationally intensive world of discovery looking at molecular interactions, the data cloud there for structure-activity relationships, how do chemicals interact with different organs or different chemicals, cell content information, imaging in preclinical, digital pathology, huge databases for clinical imaging, and the rise of telesurgery. All of these are competing for the data streams that we in healthcare have to look at integrating. And then you have the proliferation of clinical computational systems themselves. The intensive care unit now is a massive sensor network, on-body, in-body sensors, and clearly we're seeing the government get increasingly involved. So like many of you who may not be involved in medicine, we're dealing with mega data, the 3 V's, volume, variety, and velocity. Key question we have to ask is our infrastructure up to the task? The DACs are attempting to pull the sled. Our networks are increasingly global, and we have to go from molecular biology to what that means for proficient care for the patient. We live, nonetheless, in a dangerously fragmented world in healthcare. Not unique to healthcare, but healthcare is particularly bad. Silos of research, specialities, silos of clinical specialities. We like to offer opinions without too much data. Biology and medicine is not yet a quantitative discipline. For the most part, we describe things. We are the poor equivalents of the engineers. Our systems are not standardized, they're fragmented, and we still tolerate unacceptable levels of inaccurate diagnosis, and with that goes waste and risk. So we will be joining the big data world like the rest of you. This will be big data for the V3. Increasingly, as our omics profilings become automated, both in the research arena and the clinical arena, but it is this. This is the dominant issue under bullet 2, many of you are aware of. It is this cross-sector convergence and integration of those previously separate domains. This is alien to the educational curriculum. We're churning out products of profound ignorance who do not understand the relationship of this. The medical curriculum has barely changed since 1904, when Flexner made at least an attempt to make the medical curriculum more rational. So if you think about this massive flow of omics information, just stay with the genome. The other laws you're all familiar with, but next genome sequencing is doubling every 6 months, and other omics are getting there. So we are facing some real issues with regard, even if we had it standardized and had impeccable curation standards, we have a storage problem. The biggest computational network now for genes is with the Beijing Genome Institute, now colloquially simply the acronym BGI. It gives you a sense of their investment. The general word on BGI's activities are the fact that if it moves, they'll sequence it. But we are moving towards a world where we're rich in big data, and at the same time we're poor, because most universities, including the one I am at, do not have the infrastructure to deal with movement of data on this scale. It remains trapped. Forget just the intellectual silos. We do not have the pipes to move this data. I mean, we send genome data via FedEx rather than upload to the cloud, rather than uploading it. And this is going to, I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, this is a key strategic issue for the future competitiveness of the universities in this country, not just in biomedicine. It's an absolutely critical issue. Most of our systems that we have are neither scalable nor sustainable for the reasons, and I would submit that even though it is not featured prominently very much, and no doubt Vice President Biden would find a way to eye roll at this, that this is an imperative for national leadership. But this is probably the most savage confrontation for the traditional university culture, at least in biology and medicine. Most of us in biology and medicine in the universities live in that red part of the yin-yang symbol there. Reductionist rather than systems-based, individual investigator. Think about the National Institutes of Health spends almost $40 billion a year. 80% of that is on individual investigator grants. The average grant is $380,000, and 79% of investigators only have one grant. What the hell can you do with that? It's a form of academic welfare, nothing more, because in order to get these problems solved, we have to move to the blue circle. Systems-focused, team science, big data sets, because that's the reality, because the system we're living with is siloed. Funding reinforces that. At the same time, we have limited linkage between experiment and theory. Our infrastructure is inadequate, and institutional sclerosis and career barriers. I mean, I fight tenure committees for people saying, well, he doesn't have a first author publication on his own. Or, you know, he only has one R01 grant, despite the fact that he may be a co-investigator on a $36 million grant. Other disciplines have made that transition. Surely biology and medicine can, because we've got to accept that cross-domain convergence is here. We have to work in teams, automation, quantitation, and at the same time go to the other side, linking it to new curricula and career awards, because unless we become more agile, we will be living life as an anachronism. We do not in biology and medicine enjoy the same frameworks of large-scale data connectivity that our colleagues in, say, energy, engineering, astronomy, and so forth have put together. To their credit, the NSF is thinking seriously about this, at least at the discovery end of the spectrum, but at the downstream element of how you move from discovery into translation to clinical medicine, because this is what we have to do. We have to move from the world most of us live in, which is research and discovery. How do you then move that into clinical trials to validate it? Then the purple circles, the FDA or the EMA in Europe, and the people who pay for it want to say this is not only safe and effective. That used to be the criterion. Now we have to say it's safe, effective, and confers value. So the barriers keep going up, appropriate at one level. Then you have the engagement of patients, ill, consumers, us, healthy, and the role of mHealth, because I always like this quote from T.S. Eliot. Hell is the place where nothing connects, so welcome to medicine. So even if we were moving towards that linking of genotype to the phenotype with more precise clinical annotation, electronic health records were far more proficient than they were, that would still not be enough, because we've got to have the epigenome, we've got to understand people's place in larger social networks, and we've got to mine this large-scale data. But most importantly, another form of silo is called the electronic health record. It is designed only for that. All we're doing is to create electronic mimics of existing paper records. They're neither suitable for longitudinal tracking of patients, yet alone to be able to mine them in any meaningful way. And I think we could easily see this same headline 3 years from now under the High-Tech Act affecting medicine in the US, lessons from the UK, $6.5 billion basically to create a totally inoperable system. And it is this, it's the vendor trap. We've got over 700 different vendors of electronic medical records and almost 1,800 certified products. We've got to learn from other industries. I'm delighted that there are some trailblazers in this, those large healthcare institutions shown at the top there, and the Veterans Administration at the bottom, are trying to build these much larger, facile, integrative, interoperable systems. But if we're going to do it, isn't just what you record about me when you come into the emergency room or when I go to see my doc. We've got to find a way to integrate the personal omics profile. What clinical trial is available? If I come in and there's no drug available, but, your symptoms, your profile permits you to be enrolled in this investigational trial. It should be instant, right on the doc's hip and so forth. But then, of course, we come to this, almost something thou shalt not talk about, namely the growing education and knowledge gap amongst healthcare professionals at large. The first statistic is self-explanatory. Younger doctors are much more ready to accept bullet 2. We take refuge in outdated standard of care and say, oh, we'll get sued if we do anything different. Medical malpractice undoubtedly has its ugly side, but it is a very small part of the $2.7 trillion healthcare. The reason we cling to outmoded standard of care guidelines is because we don't keep up. That's the dimension. And then less than 4% of the almost 9,000 graduate programs, so this means you've already got your MD, you're going now into fellowship, only 4% of them relate to things that relate to genetic expertise. Now, relative to this tidal wave which is coming down the pike, it's pretty scary. And then, of course, how do we integrate this data into medical records? It is the busy doc. How do I see we are a visual species? The most insidious thing that was ever invented was the spreadsheet, right? Versus the question of being able to see things visually. It needs to be instant and that sort of traffic light type system. We're going to have to deploy systems for large unstructured databases. In the 2009 H1N1 influenza epidemic, there were 476 children admitted to the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania that weekend. And there were 279 different ways of recording the fact that they had a fever, right? So you've got to have ways of retrieving that using systems which are able to analyze it in that way. The other issue is the fact that even though we can sequence the genome, much of it, we don't know what it means. What does this variant that I'm carrying really mean, unless there's something already being published on it? So people say, well, we can compress all this data and only focus on it. No, we've got to think about what is the future of current data. There is another ohm called the incidental ohm, which is getting to receive some attention. So you come in to be examined for disease A, your genome is sequenced in the context of disease A, but there lurking in your genome is something which is important relative to diseases B, C, D, or N. What then in that incidental finding, namely the incidental ohm, what is the duty of the healthcare system to inform you? And much more importantly, even if we're ignorant of what that particular, if you carried variant 1508 gamma, at this point we don't know what the hell it is, but 3 years from now we do, even though your data is on file, what then should be the automated follow-up issues that follow with it? Because what we've really got to move towards is data finding data. Well, obvious to many of the people in this room, and so it is context more than anything else, intelligence and ingestion. That's the key issue. So in closing, I think what we have to think about, whether you're in discovery or clinical medicine, is how do we transcend the 20th century organizations that we're living in to basically deal with these knowledge networks. And inevitably, of course, you get into the perfectly reasonable issue. So, but we've talked about re-engineering an ecosystem that approaches 20% of GDP. You know, to use the television analogy, are the people who are in charge of it all today going to vote themselves off the island? Very unlikely, because academic research doesn't really have any accountability. It's very poor and slow in its translation of their innovation into discovery, reinforced by national funding policies. As a clinician, you have an incentive to do more because I then get reimbursed rather than do less. And industry is trapped in the tyranny of the parasites of Wall Street in terms of being unwilling. We're trapped in timid incrementalism because you're not going to say to Wall Street, I'm going to embark on a totally new area which is 10 to 15 years away. You may not understand it right now, and the stock price will be slammed. And no CEO is going to do that because then they're in trouble. So basically, we're ready to begin the next phase of keeping things exactly the way they are. But I would submit that I hope you've seen enough to think that we have to have a Staples-like reset, rethink, recalibrate, design. What's required, what is sustainable. I believe we are moving. There is progress, despite my somewhat stark statements on occasion, moving from an illness-centric dimension of episodic care and reacting only once symptoms occur to continuous care. Erratic and poor compliance to monitored compliance, the right treatment and sustaining that right treatment, from centralized delivery to increasingly distributed point of need, professional paternalism giving rise to greater democratization as patients and information becomes much more available. Well, we see the new locations and new services, the Rockwellian dimension of the doc who only had a limited number of things in his black bag. I would submit that it's going to be the CVS's, the Walgreens, and the Walmarts that are going to have these large data streams available to them, because so much of what we suffer as illness can in fact be managed very effectively out of those systems. So we move from fixed compartmentalized provider-centric facilities to increasingly distributed and virtual systems, and from episodic issues to continuous pervasive monitoring of my health and your health on an ongoing basis. So on the one hand, we've got the information generation through molecular diagnostics, MDX, devices and mobile health, drugs and health information. On the other side, patients ill, consumers well, and then the services for integrating that. But we will see in those blue boxes an entirely new set of business models and services evolve for data aggregation, because it is the rise of digital healthcare. Molecular medicine, omics, and your personalized omics profile, buttressed then by device-based medicine, sensors and mobile health and remote health monitoring, Those two sum to information-based healthcare, which should logically then drive us to the bottom, outcomes-based healthcare and sustaining health. Sustaining health economically for society, sustaining health for you and me individually. We're all familiar with Schumpeterian creative destruction, so whether it be the eclipse of the sailing boat, the eclipse of the buggy, or some of us in this audience are old enough to remember a company from Rochester, New York, who failed to understand that the digital world might evolve. But what is the history? What is the history of all these examples of creative destruction? They tend to arise at the margins of existing fields. And the people who are the leaders, whether they be key academic opinion leaders or the leading company of the time, says, oh, no, that'll never happen. Or, well, they won't get into, they're going to go after this market segment. And then 5 years later, the Kodakian demise is at hand. And I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, in concluding, disruptive innovation in healthcare is going to be driven by the following factors. Technological convergence, we've already talked about it. Consumerism, and all of that leads to the demands for greater cost control, which each of us as citizens should ask for. Precision diagnosis drives rational therapy. Risk identification and mitigation becomes the central organizing theme for all healthcare discovery and delivery. And at the same time, by definition, it is the big data world writ large. Computational biomedicine, not just in terms of analyzing all of those integrated data streams, massive data streams for mobile health and electronic health. How will we transcend our limited human cognitive capabilities through human-machine interactions? Alarming deficiencies in our adaptability to meet the transdisciplinary requirements of convergence there, and we need to urgently and quickly update our education and training programs, and new competition by definition will arise because all of those things are driving us towards new value propositions. So in short, molecular medicine is the foundation for precision diagnostics and personalized therapeutics. The infocosm of healthcare is this integration of these vast data streams coming at us, that those two combined are the intellectual catalyst for sustainable health. But the real winners in this will be those who can master data-intensive biomedicine. So I've had a superficial surf across a broad array of topics. That's the website for these slides, which are available if you'd like to use them, and other talks which I've given. And for those of you who are coming to Arizona for the Inform meeting, we hope you have a great time here. Those of us who live here think it's a great place to live. And Ron and Informs, thank you for the invitation to come. Thanks.